I've been working, as Janis mentioned, on ethics and the concept of ethics as methods since around 2003. And I'll mention that I come to this talk from a background in communication studies, as it is understood and trained in the United States. And I have worked across my degrees with what broadly could be construed as texts, or what counts as texts. I'm an ethnographer with a long history and training and a couple of degrees in rhetorical studies of using various kinds of text and discourse analysis. But I don't have a linguistics background, so you'll see that I'm coming at this topic from the perspective of sociology and internet cultural studies, perhaps. I also should mention that I'm neither an ethicist nor a philosopher. My starting point for thinking about ethics emerged in the late 90s, when researchers were having very interesting debates about how to follow ethical guidelines that didn't seem to fit the contexts we were studying. And for me, the issues could all be answered through method. So in today's talk, I want to talk first about ethics and then methods as ethics, and then a concept of impact as a framework for thinking about future making. And in case you have to leave, I guess I'll give my main point. So you can take this with you, that from my perspective, and what I'm going to argue here is that methods and ethics are strengthened considerably when they are merged. And they can be strengthened conceptually and practically when we superimpose the characteristics of each concept onto the other concept. For me, I start from the perspective of methods, or a kind of embodied practice of doing research to ask the deceptively simple question, how do we do ethics? And I am inspired by this statement by ethnographer and a lecturer of energy and society at the University of Edinburgh, Laura Watts, who says that futures are made and fixed in mundane social and material practice, in timetables, in corporate roadmaps, in designers' drawings, in standards, in advertising, in conversations, in hope and despair, in imaginaries made flesh. From my perspective, if we're here to change the world as scholars and scientists, this requires us to be proactive in our interventions or in our research designs. And this in turn requires us to recognize what frameworks might be guiding us invisibly in our practice. And then visibilize these frames that influence our thinking so that we can understand how they have shaped and delimited what we think is the right practice or the right way to do ethics. And it's by unpacking these frameworks around method and around ethics that I think we can get to a more robust practice of what we can do in the context of an ethics climate where a lot of what we are learning is what not to do or how not to act, which isn't very helpful when we actually need to do something. So let me begin with a little bit of a brief discussion of ethics and how I believe in my own experience through this history of the last 25 years of studying the internet, how I think that the conversations around ethics have changed. It has been mentioned, and Karen, who spoke previously in the day did a wonderful job of characterizing some of the discussion. So I'm hoping to get through a lot of this very quickly, this discussion. But I want to think about this in terms of how, not what ethics are, but how ethics have been framed over the past 20 years and how that's different than how they were framed perhaps historically. Ethics rarely means the same thing to everyone. And most often when we hear the word, we're thinking about morals and philosophy, which again, Karen mentioned in her work when she was talking about virtue ethics or utilitarianism or deontological approaches. And if we are scientists or working in academic settings, we're most often thinking of ethics as regulations. And then for me as a methodologist or as a philosopher of method, I'm thinking of ethics as everyday practice, where it is about doing the right thing, being a person with good values, taking care, or avoiding being creepy. And people, this is quite a familiar concept for laypersons, but this often gets sidelined in scientific, social research, or technological development settings. So I'm going to pick up on the second frame and move forward from there. And I won't spend much time on this, but when we think about where the frameworks come from and how ethical principles guide research, I think it's useful to begin with the idea that for most of the history of science, practice was, and particularly following World War II, researchers have been guided by an error avoidance model of ethics. That is to say, because of egregious ethical violations against humans in scientific tests and experiments, various international bodies came to a very rapid consensus about what would constitute a strong ethical approach towards science, and that is that certain moral principles are universal and recognizable, and that ethical behaviors by scientists can and should be formalized to protect against these potential violations and protect against harm, and avoiding errors and practicing, avoiding errors and protecting humans as subjects of research is paramount. And it's very important to keep these in mind because they still inform practice. But what became very apparent to me when I started to study ethics is that when ethical principles got translated into regulations, they lost a lot of their initial ability to allow scientists to make decisions on their own. So, for example, these very core ideas about respect for persons and justice and beneficence got operationalized and have become very common in American institutional research boards or other ethics research boards around the world as concepts and like human subjects or informed consent or privacy or vulnerability. And these inform regulatory frameworks. And so when we hit the internet, or when you hit, anthropology and ethnography, which predate the internet, but are not biomedical contexts within which these regulations were invented. Researchers in the 90s were very quick to note that it was complicated to determine what is a human subject. What is consent? What is informed consent? And how do we get it in particular kinds of contexts which are characterized by global networks of anonymous participants? Moreover, should we get informed consent? Without getting into the details of it, again, this is a marvelous and long conversation, and many scholars have contributed to debates about such things. It's worth also mentioning that it's almost impossible to protect personally identifiable information. Vulnerability often occurs after the fact, and risk-benefit ratio, which has been a dominant theme at least in most Western contexts, is not at all a universal perspective. I'm not going to dwell again, and you could read reviews of these elsewhere, and I might point you to the Association of Internet Researchers' various ethics guideline documents for lists of resources and papers that can review such things. And I also have a list of resources at the end of the talk, which I'll share with participants. But as I mentioned, these typical models tend to focus only on misconduct or what not to do. And I find that this is very limiting because it doesn't provide robust frameworks for engaging in ethical practice. It only tells you what constitutes unethical practice. So if I think about the shifts that have occurred over the last few years, I would point to, and this is again my own experience of these shifts, the idea that scientific researchers and particularly in internet related studies or in studies of digital media or mediated culture or computer mediated communication have had conversations where it was clear that we started to understand that our enactment of anything ethical is going to be built on how we understand ethics in the first place. And that ethics, especially in regulatory or regulated settings, is always going to be enacted. And therefore, if we can just step back and identify some of the frames that are informing our concepts about ethics, we can rethink practice as well as the concepts. And this shift I characterize as kind of a shift from regulatory models or regulation or error-driven approaches to process or context-driven approaches. And in that, there's a refinement of the concepts that inform one's process. Now, I was involved in the Association of Internet Researchers Ethics Committee, and I became the primary author of the 2012 guidelines, an 8-page document. And what I didn't realize at the time was that this document became a document not of statements, but of questions. And it took us 6 years to write this 8 pages as an international committee. And and then later, the head of the Norwegian Ethics Council remarked to me that this document of 8 pages had more than 56 questions. And that did not include this final page, which was a handout of, a shortcut guide to, thinking about what you should think about when you're collecting certain kinds of data. So if I zoom in on some of this, you can see that it's, I don't know if you can read that. I'm zooming a little bit more. I mean, the whole document is littered with questions. And that illustrates the extent to which there are no answers, right? And that emphasizes, for me, the extent to which ethical dilemmas are only to be addressed in the process of doing a project, and that it is in these micro decisions that we're making throughout the process of answering these various myriad unending questions about what is the right thing to do and how it's going to affect these people, or how, what is going to be the impact of our research. It's only in the answering of those that we actually are enacting an ethical framework. Sally Wyatt also talks about this in not starting in 2011, but this is when I saw her talk and used her slides here to emphasize that from this process-based perspective or context-based perspective, that ethics occur at different stages of the process, and each moment is going to offer a different kind of ethical dilemma, and it's going to require a different kind of enactment of maybe a different kind of ethical concept or a principle. So what this does is it takes ethics from this kind of abstract moral position that one can determine in advance, right down to the ground, where in a daily practice you're making active decisions, and those each have an ethical component. So I started to think about how could I visualize this for my own edification, and I came up with what is, perhaps a very clip art-ish, kind of graphic, but it works for me, where I completely bring ethics down to the level of making decisions. And these decisions are, they occur at critical junctures, when we might hit a moment and we have to ask a question, and our answer to the question will take us down a different path. And then we'll hit another critical juncture and we'll ask another question, and we will then make another decision. And so each question that arises is going to create a path of inquiry practice. And this isn't without consequence. This is in the first case, all the alternative paths we could have taken, or the alternative decisions we could have taken, are in some ways grayed out, and we move on. It doesn't mean we couldn't go back to revisit some of those decisions, but generally speaking, we're meeting deadlines and making decisions that might be actually seemingly quite logistical decisions, not even philosophical decisions. So these create a path, and these are pathways to knowledge, and it emphasizes the extent to which, and this is something Karen also mentioned in her talk, that the decisions are made by humans, and these pathways have consequence for the communities that are involved. But it also has consequences for the types of future knowledge that are generated. And so a decision today will impact, how future researchers think. And this is identical to how methods work. So you could say that this is also a model of method, that methods are no more or less than choices we make at critical junctures when we hit a particular moment when we have to make a decision. And that decision will take us in a particular new direction. And there are innumerable other directions we could have gone. So this is a very perhaps seemingly oversimplistic notion of method, but it's a core to all inquiry practices, whether you're a gardener trying to figure out how to plant better growing carrots next year, or a detective trying to figure out, who committed the crime, or you are a social researcher or a machine learning specialist. Anyway, I started to try to also think about how would this play out if I was thinking about this in terms of a particular study. What kinds of decision points might we hit? And these, if you think about all the practical as well as the methodological choices you might make and the ethical decisions that come along with each of those, the whole thing can get a bit dizzying, because if you added even your own studies to this, or if I were to expand this series of moments into the actuality of a real research project, this graphic would be much bigger. And each one of these moments has a particular ethic attached to it, as well as a different kind of methodology. So it's quite it doesn't simplify the process, it actually complicates what's involved when we're thinking about ethics. But I think it does so quite usefully. So when we think about this shift of ethics from, regulatory models or regulation-driven models to process-driven models, the process-driven models naturally compel researchers to focus more on their everyday practices. And I'm going to complicate this a bit more, because I think that our everyday practices sit at one arena of methodology, if we think about it. For example, the decision points that we might make don't just occur below the surface of method in our everyday habits of inquiry. These also are influenced at the level that is above method, where we are influenced by various kinds of social and political and economic conditions that influence directly how we ought to, or how we actually think about a research project, a research design. And it's worth considering what kinds of frames are influencing us at this level above method, not quite at the level of epistemology, but at the level of all the other frames that, well, it is epistemology in a sense, but thinking about like the economic considerations of competing for shrinking pools of funding, and therefore designing studies that have a particular kind of merit. Regulation of research by research boards, creating environments where researchers are afraid to do certain kinds of research because of the limitations imposed from above or outside of their own instinct. Closer scrutiny of one's research by tax-paying publics, who then want to see the justification for research in evidence-based science. And within these political conditions, how is our own role or our own decision-making process being shaped and delimited? You can apply this same kind of logic to our thinking about ethics, to think about, sort of what are some of the conditions that are framing our ethical sensibilities. But in this case, more importantly, I want to emphasize that this moment gives us an opportunity to understand that ethics don't just come from above, and they don't exist in a vacuum. But when we think about our everyday habits and choices, we can start to understand that we're actually not just enacting someone else's ethics, we're creating future ethics through those micro choices that we make. So the decisions that we make have much more consequence once we start to think about how they build a framework for others in the future. Okay, within this, I'm going to talk a little bit about a third shift. So we see this shift perhaps to process and context-driven approaches. And I think we're now seeing in the last 10 years, and in my own work, I see this very clearly, a shift toward thinking, in addition to this idea about ethics as embedded and in intersecting with method, to this idea that if that's the case, then we might want to be thinking about how our methods are building different kinds of futures. What kind of impact do our methods, our choices, our decisions have? And I think you can see this in lots of discussions that have led to critical approaches to technology development, particularly since 2014 and the rise of ethics as a concern in the public sphere after Snowden released his findings about the NSA collecting data in surreptitious ways from citizens. This was followed by a lot of other platform sponsored ethics crises or large-scale data sharing problems, and you could sort of see that there's a strong understanding now that traditional notions of privacy have disappeared. Research ethics are not just about human subjects, especially in the regulatory sphere, but moving more and more toward large-scale conceptual and regulatory frameworks around data protection and issues of datafication, more broadly speaking. And you'll see a strong focus in recent years on bias, fairness, accountability, transparency, and rights of people. And I think if we push this a little bit forward into the future, we can sort of see that it doesn't take much to go to the place where we already have autonomous and automated systems that collect and aggregate and analyze data on our behalf, that datafication is totalized, data is pervasive. And here I give a nod to my colleague Michael Zimmer's work, which I think I provide a source to on the end, that ethics in this case then can be seen as more of an activist mode, admittedly normative, but certainly thinking toward intervention to build better, sustainable, ethical futures. And of course, ethics still remains situated, as always, and contested. So it's not that these issues get solved, but we are shifting toward much more critical models around research design and interventionist ideas that are intended to build different futures. And that requires us to go back to very basic questions about what's the purpose of the research in the first place? Why are we doing it? And many would insist that developing knowledge for knowledge's sake is simply not enough when we confront global crises at the magnitudes that we're seeing with the pandemic and the shifting nature of work and the consequence of radical right and repressive governments on their peoples, and the power of automated decision making to have serious consequences on people's lives and livelihood. And many people in today's talks have been talking about some of those consequences and how they've been dealing with them or thinking about them in their own research. It's worth mentioning that some very interesting large-scale bodies of thinkers and think tanks and sort of organizations are creating documents that reflect this future-making kind of ethic. So the Montreal Declaration has some wonderful future-oriented thinking in its own statement. The Human Genome Organization has clarified that all genomic research should reduce inequality, generate public social benefits, and build equity, and have defined the public good in a very proactive way, which is a signal. It's a signal shift from kind of thinking about science as producing, knowledge about humans to science producing knowledge that has to be restrained because it is potentially getting out of control because of algorithmic and automated systems. I find this quite fascinating and important. And within this, then, I developed a framework for thinking about ethics as impact, right? So this builds from an idea that, like all ethics are methods and all methods are ethics. And you intertwine those concepts. And then the natural step, if you're going to change the world, is to say, well, all right, then I'm going to have to acknowledge that all research is going to have impact at some level. And researchers play a key role in creating better or worse possible futures through their everyday practices. And many of those practices are quite tacit and or discipline driven and or tied or constrained by disciplinary kinds of constraints or regulatory or extant legal spheres within which one might be working. And I would not want to suggest these are not useful as boundaries, but we are seeing a shift in recent years toward balancing those constraints with other exigencies like climate change or automated decision-making or surveillance societies. And if we all have impact, then an impact model of ethics can be an attitude. It can be a mindset more than a set of regulations or guidelines. And of course, it doesn't replace extant guidelines or legal rules. But in any case, you can sort of start to think about impact on levels of on somewhat of a scale. So here's a potential scale. It's one of my own, and you could create your own. Like, what kinds of scales do you use if you think of your own work as having both short-term and long-term impact, direct and indirect, personal or social and cultural impact? So what kind of items belong on the scales and what are the, what are the two ends of the spectrum that you might be working on. I have then thought about this idea of there being perhaps four, maybe only three impacts arenas. And I think that when I divided this up into arenas for thinking about our impact, it helped me get away from an exclusive focus, as was common and dominant in the social sciences and all social research practice in the 20th century, away from just thinking about human subjects and thinking more about different kinds of considerations, like where else might our decisions have impact. So I thought I would briefly go over these and then open this up for some discussion. The first impact arena is the most common. It is treatment of people, and this is most common if you're in the social or humanistic sciences or in academic settings where we're looking at things like human subjects, which intersects with the digital quite heavily. That on one level, we can think about people as including participants, but it's also thinking about the data that represents people. And it might also include people that don't get thought of very often in the context of one's research design, and that might be the self. So if we think about treatment of people on that scale, it's quite, it expands what we mean by what that can include. The second impact arena is around side effects of technology design or prototype testing, or the side effects of research design. And it's natural and unavoidable that any research in technology design will be accompanied by unintended side effects and consequences. And those might be even obvious and provoked, as with prototype testing. They might be immediate, or they might be downstream. They might be small scale or large scale. And it might be directly linked to one's research and technology design, or a result of multiple factors at larger infrastructural and ecological levels. So, I'm sure that the researcher who released the data set from OkCupid, a prominent dating site, didn't intend for the data set to be identifying profiles of actual people, because he said it had been stripped and cleaned of all of its metadata. And yet in 2 hours after releasing the data set, somebody was able to reverse engineer based on some of the other information and cross calculation of aggregated data sets, was able to re-identify participants or dating profiles. There are other examples of side effects. I'll move on to the next impact arena, though, which is to actually say that data use becomes an interesting impact arena to think about, because one's data is often used to do other things, or accidentally gets fed into systems that end up having significant impact on people, and categorizations of people become quite an important feature of this particular arena. And earlier talks today have spoken of some of the ways that human characteristics in machine learning systems get abstracted, or that categorizations through aggregation can have particular impacts on whole groups of people. So this is far beyond the treatment of specific people during a study. This is around the generation of future categories based on the use of data. And obviously, these 3 texts have not been, I don't think they've been mentioned by name, but these become very important texts for the last 5 years to think about such issues. The fourth arena is around more large scale or long-term changes on the frameworks that people exist within. These are this, if we look at it from a negative perspective, could be exemplified by what we see in, say, Black Mirror episodes, or a graphic that shows that we've become ergonomically messed up from technology design, or that we live in a constant surveillance society. But one of the interesting things about the this future-oriented impact model is that it allows us to think about ethics as a the kind of impact of ethics. The ethical impact as being maybe avoiding causing harm, but also creating and doing the right thing, or creating positive outcomes. So it takes science from being only about mitigating harm or avoiding errors, and about being proactive and wanting to think about how, if we're going to have impact, what kind of impact should we have? And that it puts us in a different position. And to sort of then end, it would be to offer a provocation that reframing one's positionality might be to conflate ethics as methods and methods as ethics, but then to remix or be fearless about engaging in methodologies that grapple with the complexity of the contexts and the problems we're facing, and reframing research likewise as a kind of an intervention rather than just an explanation. And then conceptualizing impact not just as a negative potential, but as a fruitful, strong ethic. So I will stop there and open it up for questions. And again, if you have any questions about this that we don't get to here, I'm happy to answer those by email. And you can read more about this work in my own, from my own articles or thoughts on this. You could go to the Association of Internet Researchers 3 ethics guideline documents now, which are quite comprehensive in scope, but also very complex in thinking and full of questions rather than statements. And you can also have a look at some other resources here. Thank you very much.